The New Deal experiment. Roosevelt got himself elected president, and he did not have a firm plan of action like Abraham Lincoln of a couple generations before him. He just hoped that somehow the problems would take care of themselves. Now, I'll say this about the Depression. To this day, we really don't know for sure what caused it. And we really don't know for sure what would have cured it. But if you get anything out of the lesson today, and I've been told I should have one theme, the one theme is government help did not Government help did not end the Depression. That's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. It's one theme that I want that you have run through. There were several things that were part of what Roosevelt called his New Deal. You see all these abbreviations. Well, first of all, the one idea of rating a president on his first 100 days, that started with Roosevelt. A lot of Roosevelt's New Deal measures were passed during his first 100 days in office. It's been said on the day of his inauguration, he wanted to get right to work right away. Well, his secretary had taken the day off to celebrate. So had most of his staff. Not one of his cabinet was available. Even his janitors couldn't be found, and he finally just went to bed. That was his first day of office. But the other 99 days after that, everybody came back to work, and he got busy and got a whole lot of legislation passed. Some of this most of this is no longer in force, but two pieces of the New Deal legislation is still around. The FDIC and Social Security. And I've told you, I get a Social Security check every month. I get one in 4 days. Anyway, that's something else. But anyway, Social Security. Still around. Now, the FDIC, this was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed that if you deposited your money in a bank that was insured with the FDIC, you were guaranteed to get your money back if the bank failed. To this day, nobody who has ever deposited anything in the FDIC has lost a dime. I say that tongue-in-cheek. I mean, that's still true. But we've had two financial crises during my lifetime, one under Ronald Reagan and one about 10 years ago under the second George Bush. Two big and it was pointed out that the FDIC, in Roosevelt's day, they insured deposits up to $10,000. Today it's up to, I believe, $250,000. And they might say, what if you have more than that? You better insure it in two separate banks or two separate deposits. But the FDIC is not big enough to take care of a major financial collapse. So folks, you can still lose your money. If we had a really, really big financial collapse, and here's the sad story, if one bank collapses, it's a domino type effect. And they all could. Now, fortunately, Ronald Reagan was able to rein it in, and during his measure, we're going to talk about this later. And then in 2008, we had another near collapse of the financial markets, savings and loan, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those were big, big time. Most of you might be too young to remember it, but believe me, I'm old enough to remember it quite well. It happened just shortly after I retired from Lockheed. But anyway, the FDIC is not big enough now to take care of all of them. Social Security, all right, folks, I've got to say this about Social Security. A lot of folk believe it won't be there for you when you get older. Do all you can to save your money now, as much as possible. Social Security and Medicare are both on the verge of bankruptcy. I mean, have any of you heard this outside of me? Okay, a couple of you raising your hand. The rest of you need to hear it.
Do they still send you? I know they still send me now. What if I was to stop working now, never pay another dime, this is what I'll make at the age of 65.
They'll still send it,
Yeah,
yeah.
I still get
Yeah.
those.
And see, they sent me a record one time of all the money I earned from my first job back in 1967. And those days, FICA, F-I-C-A, took out about $3 a week out of my weekly paycheck, $2 or $3. And I was making $2.02 an hour, which I thought was great. Back in, times have changed. But back in 1967, that was above minimum wage, $2.02 per hour, $80 per week, 40-hour week, $80.80, and FICA. And I'd wonder, what is FICA, F-I-C-A? Someone later said Social Security. But over the years, but see, the bad thing to what Social Security is, now, if I were to die today, my wife would collect it till the day she died. But I can't pass it on to my heirs. Hopefully all of you know that. And also, that money that I worked for was supposed to be saved up for me. And most of my students tell me that they know this. Instead, the money that, as I was paying it in, it was going to older people who were on Social Security, and my money has already been spent. So the money I'm collecting now is money that you younger people are contributing, if you are. All right, you've heard that too, and I think you've probably heard that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you've heard that too. You know, that money is not being saved and stored up for you folk.
Well, it's
It's-
also because they're living much longer than expected.
What's
Because,
that?
They're living longer.
Well, yes, that's the thing.
Much
See,
longer.
they expected that most people would not live to be 65 when the law was passed. Well, we are.
Because they need to actually change it because technology and medicine is keep evolving and evolving. It's gonna make it capable of people living longer and longer and longer.
That's true.
And so it's just.
And Social Security cannot keep, but something else, folk, I've got to say this. Abortion has killed 60 million babies, and those babies who were not born are not contributing. I'll save that for later, but that is another thing that's destroying our Social Security system. Our young people are not having babies. Throughout all of history, it's the young people who support us older folk as we get older. And if we're not having babies, and the Japanese are doing worse than we are, if we're not having babies, the whole system's going to collapse. But anyway, Social Security is still with us. Now, something else I want to remind you of, and this you're going to see throughout the rest of the book. By the way, I'm going to tell you, more and more as I read the book, and I was reading it this morning, I got in this camp, near this campus 2 hours early, and I stopped at where I was allowed to loiter, and read ahead a little bit. Every time you think you're solving a problem, another problem comes in and creeps up. And sometimes the problem that creeps up is worse than the problem you're trying to solve. This you'll find out. This is what we're going to run into. I mean, the federal government gave aid to education. Your authors will make it sound like that's wonderful. But education went way downhill when the federal government got involved. I mean, that's just one example. Anyway, all right. Roosevelt started his fireside chats. Now, in those days, almost every home had a radio. The transistor had not been invented, so the radios were so expensive that most homes only had one. So they'd gather around the radio, the family would, and the father would oftentimes hold his hand, use his body as an antenna, hold his hand on an antenna wire to increase, and the radios were full of static. But they'd sit around in the living room or the fireplace and listen to the radio while Roosevelt conducted his famous fireside chats. A famous line in the chat, I'm going to try to sound like this guy. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Keep in mind, Roosevelt could not walk at this point, and he had suffered from polio. Now, as for Roosevelt, well, your book opens up with a little vignette about Florence Owens. Florence Owens is still, her picture is still seen. Florence Owens, he was an attractive young woman who had been married, had several children, then her husband died, and then the Great Depression came, and she had to work really, really hard in the fields. That was the only thing she was qualified to do. She worked really hard in the fields to feed her children, and sometimes she got help from her children, but some reporter put her picture on a magazine, and she became a famous person overnight. Yeah, they showed the picture of her and her 7 children picking beets in a field, and here you see a picture of her on page 622. Opening vignette. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, he was at the center of the time. It has been said that during the depressed years of the 30s, the kids got Superman. The Superman comics started the time. The older people who were too old to dream of fantasy got Roosevelt. Roosevelt folk did not end the Depression. The New Deal did not end it. And this is historical fact. This is not just my opinion. I mean, it's historical fact. Government help, government aid did not end it. The Depression ended abruptly when World War II, when it got in full swing. Only then. And if I had to say, well, what did the war have to do with it? In wartime, everybody who wants to work is employed. People, the factories actually try to steal each other's workers because they can get a lot of profit. You know, everything they make, the government's going to buy. They don't have to advertise. But anyway, wartime economy. Now, some of his other New Deal legislation were the SEC, Securities and Exchange. Folk, this is going to sound bad. He put Joseph P. Kennedy in charge. Securities Exchange was to regulate the stock market. In other words, the stock market seemingly had caused the Depression, so we're going to regulate the stock market. He put Joseph Kennedy, who had been instrumental in crashing the market in the first place, put him in charge. It was like putting the wolf in charge of the hen house. Guarding the hen house. But Social Security was passed, and that one is still around. I've already mentioned that. Social Security, that at age 65 you could start collecting money that you'd saved up. And also, for the first time, the government took your money before you got it. In other words, you could measure your pay in terms of take-home pay. Now, I remember I was 18 years old, just out of high school. I got my first job, was with a paper mill, factory job, to help work my way through college. I made $80.80 a week, of which I actually took home $64.28. Where'd the rest of it go? Government taxes, federal taxes, income taxes, local city taxes, and Social Security. So that was taken from my pay before I got it. And then what was left, $64, that was supposedly my money. But anyway, Social Security, it was taken out of your pay before you get it, and it was saved for you. The government has records that go all the way back to 1967. And just keep in mind, this was before the home computer. But they used computers back then, but the computers cost about $1 million a piece, and only the government had them. And well, the big institutions, the big universities had them. One computer, Lockheed had one. Really expensive to maintain, and it took a staff, a small platoon of technicians and engineers to keep them running. They broke down constantly, and they had to keep every part of them air conditioned because it generated quite a bit of heat. But they did have computers. Anyway, Social Security, not in Roosevelt state, but I mean when I was just out of high school. Now, all these other programs, designed to help work. The CCC was designed for young people. Oh, slow down. Mostly young men, I say young people, pardon me, young men. To get young men employed, it was the Civilian Conservation Corps. I'll pause and let those of you who want to write it down.
Civilian what?
Civilian Conservation. CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC designed to help get young men to work mainly in the forest. So now here was the catch-22 to the CCC, and this was going on even when I was a kid growing up in my dad's home. Most of the time, a young man would get employed and work for 30 days and then get laid off. I'm not talking about 30 working, I'm talking about 30 calendar days, which means he'd draw about 4.5 paychecks, then get laid off. And then you would hope, each man who hired would hope that somehow he would be considered good enough where they'd keep him on, but most of them weren't. But the CCC was designed for temporary work in hopes that somehow the economy would pick up and these men could get a permanent job once they got off. Also, once you were laid off, maybe after 90 days of being laid off, you might get hired back on with a CCC, but it wasn't like you worked 30 and off 30. I mean, you were worked 30 and you were off far more than you were on. TVA, now this one still exists. Tennessee Valley Authority. Lake Lanier was created by the TVA, and Lake Allatoona also, up in Tennessee where I went to school. Lake Ocoee was created by the TVA. A series of dams. The purpose was to control flooding. I mean, again, you can imagine at one time flooding was a big problem in the South. The TVA controlled flooding by keeping the water in reservoirs, I might say. And it also provided for cheap hydroelectric power. The dams would, as the water went over the dams, it would turn wheels, which in turn would turn generators. And again, some people at the time thought, what is there about the water that creates electricity? Well, just simply the water had the power to turn a turbine. And this turbine created the electricity. And it was a constant source of cheap power that would provide electricity to places in rural America.
You said the TVA stands for what now? The Tennessee?
Tennessee Valley Authority. Even though it spread beyond the Tennessee River. But it dammed up the water in the Tennessee River, the water in the Ocoee River, the water in the Chattahoochee River, and a whole bunch of rivers here in the southeast. And in Kentucky, where my grandfather had a farm, the government bought his farm because he lived on a creek and the water rose up. They told him the water would rise up to the level of the barn, but they were wrong about that. But the water did rise up and covered up all his farmland. But he used the money he got from the government to buy land higher up, and that was the land he lived on the rest of his life. But Tennessee Valley Authority, mainly it built dams, and again, it's still around. AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. All right, this one's interesting. In order to build up prices, because prices of food were so low, the government, among other things, eventually slaughtered a whole lot of young hogs, baby hogs, to build up, so the hog meat would be more scarce and it would help boost prices. Also, the government began paying farmers, and my mother had some relatives who were farmers, so I have farmer relatives. And the government still pays farmers to let some of their land lie idle and not grow anything on it. Any of you familiar with this? At least one or two of you. Yeah, that's well. You probably grew up in a big city, but having grown up, I mean, yes, I'm a country boy of sorts. But anyway, the government would, and that's in the book, by the way. The government would just pay farmers to let their land lie idle and not grow any crops on it. The government would also buy up surplus, and these surplus would be used, and still is, for at least the last count it was used for school lunches. That's why kids could get their lunches so cheap. We often, when I was a kid, would pay a quarter for a lunch, and it went up to 35 and 45 cents a meal. Again, you could not buy it that cheap at a restaurant. I don't know what it is now, but when I was teaching, it was 45 cents a meal. And again, the government would buy up and would use these surplus to feed its school children. And this business of school lunches is still an issue for another reason. It was Mrs. Obama tried to make sure that the kids only ate healthy food and the kids would throw it out. You know about it. Yeah, one of my daughters is a school teacher. She said the kids do not eat their lunches. So a lot of schools are going back to the old type lunches the kids will eat, which is supposedly unhealthy. Oh, I mean, by the way, I'll pause another minute. If any of you have papers to turn in, I'll take them now. And is Alpha Jello, okay, he done the other class. Here, I'll take them now.
I had called you, I gave you the wrong one. That's
Oh,
okay.
and
That's
I did
me.
not bring your old one
That's fine.
in, but that's
You can toss it, that's okay.
Yeah, I did bring the ones I graded. I did not grade yours
That's
after your
okay.
phone call.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And yeah, you'll still get credit for early turn in.
Thank you.
Again, that's on the syllabus. Okay, I'll move on. Now, AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. Your book also says that the AAA did not benefit blacks at all. And folks, again, this is historical fact. AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. Then the WPA, that's the one I was talking earlier, bridges, up to the time I went to college, a lot of them in the country still had WPA on them. Again, mostly small one-lane bridges, and you had the signs warned it's a one-lane bridge. Before your car had to stop, everybody had to stop and look and make sure no car was on the bridge before you drove on it. And again, in the 1930s, when there were so few cars, this was okay. Now today, all these bridges have been replaced with wider bridges, and I have not been on a one-lane bridge, I guess, in 35 or 40 years. I don't know if there are many of them around or not, but
What does it stand for?
Works Progress Administration. And again, the Works Progress Administration would hire workers for a few months. 3 men, I want you to remember, Father Conklin, Huey Long, and Dr. Townsend. Father Conklin was a Catholic priest, Father Charles Conklin. You might compare him to Rush Limbaugh, except in those days, Rush Limbaugh is a talk show host, and he has the telephones, but in those days they didn't have the technology to connect a telephone to a radio. At least it was not commonplace in most stations. So Father Conklin would come on the radio at a certain time every day, and he came on in many, many stations at the same time. And at first he was for Roosevelt's New Deal, but he strongly believed, all 3 of these men believed in an equitable distribution of income. In other words, everybody should make the same amount of money, and those who made more should be taxed and their excess given to the poor. I think all of you know what I think about that idea without me going into detail. But nevertheless, maybe some of you agree with that. I mean, in one of your papers, one of you wrote, "The rich have far more money than they need." I want to elaborate on that a little bit. Somebody who's making $300 a week and spending $299, another person is making $1,000 a week and spending $1,010, another person is making $10,000 a week and spending $10,500. Which one of these men would you think are the richest?
One making $300.
This man. He's at least spending less than he takes in. Very few of us in America are spending less than we take in. Frankly, I'm not one of them. But,
Yeah.
yes.
That's where, me personally, I struggle, because now if we go with this, like you said, this new modern thing where the rich has more money and they should
Yeah.
you should take and just redistribute what this man has worked for. That's where I think I personally struggle to, because, okay, wait a minute, so if I buy into the principle of be a good steward over my own money, so now I gotta take my extra, or my extra has to be taken from me and redistributed amongst people who refuse to live by that principle, that you spend less, you have later in life, you have more you can use, but they wanna spend more than what they actually bring in. Now, I gotta sit here and I'm working for people outside of my house, so I don't know, that's just my thought process, and I'm not.
Well, that's mine too. I mean, hey,
To me,
Again,
we're personal, make it personal for
I
yourself.
talk about Walt Disney because my daughter worked for Disney. If Walt Disney had not been rich, Walt Disney is the biggest employer on one campus in the country. Think of all the people that Walt Disney World could not hire if they weren't for a rich man. And Walt Disney built Disney World. I can't picture Walt Disney getting a saw and sawing a board to length and then nailing, but he still gets credit for building Disney World because he had the money to do it. He hired the worker. Now, the men he hired, I mean, they did the sawing, they did the nailing, they did the bricklaying, they did the concrete pouring. I don't doubt he drew a sketch, but then he turned it over to the professional artist to actually draw up the blueprints that was necessary to build this stuff. But again, without a rich man, you don't have Disney World. And now there's a rich man trying to get us to Mars. The government can't do it, it's too expensive. There's a rich man trying to get us to our space station without the money. So I say, let the rich get richer. I don't care that they have more than I do. I mean, let them. The richer they get, the richer I'm going to get. That's trickle down. Let it be trickle down. I don't care. But anyway, they believe in taking money from the rich folk, which if we had, there would be no Disney World today. And most of the business we have would not be today, and most of us eventually have crashed into a level of poverty. We'd be no higher than the American Indians were when we found them in 1492.
I think we'll be pleasantly surprised if we see that those who are rich, how they truly live, and those, instead of the ones you see on TV. But if you sit and look at the real rich people that are around you, you'll be pleasantly surprised.
They live in homes that are more modest than the ones most, and they drive old beat-up cars oftentimes.
Yep.
They drive beat-up cars, they live in modest houses. That's how they got to be rich.
Yep.
The worst thing you can do, folk, if you want to be rich, live in a mansion.
Yeah. Money pit.
Just ask Evander Holyfield. He once made $20 million a year, which is a lot even. Evander Holyfield, but guess what? Today, Evander Holyfield is practically bankrupt.
Yep.
Mike Tyson is not much better off.
Yep. Money pits.
Couldn't handle it. But anyway, again, this person here is on a different level of poverty. Now, you might think this person's in poverty. We all are in poverty. But some of us are in poverty down here in this level. Some of us are in poverty on this level. Some are in poverty on this level. But nobody knows better than the rich that they have as much trouble or more trouble balancing their budgets than the rest of us do. Anyway, Father Conklin. Now, here's where Father Conklin made his big mistake. He began to tell the country how wonderful fascism was in Italy, where every man was employed. Did you notice I said man? Mussolini did not believe that women should work outside a home. He believed women should stay home and bear children to build up the country. Stalin and Hitler believed the same thing. And folk, evil as those three men were, I'm going to take their side on a lot of that part of the issue. But anyway, every man who didn't have work under Mussolini, he drafted into the army. And of course, in the army, you may know, they feed you, they clothe you, they house you, they pay you a little bit. So they were considered employed. He had full employment. But guess what? Eventually the United States went to war against Mussolini, and Father Conklin was left out on a limb. I mean, far out on a limb. And and all of a sudden he became extremely unpopular. He left the raid. He was never able to make a comeback from that. But he sided with a person that, well, they would wind up going to war against. Huey Long. Huey Long was a Louisiana congressman who said, every man a king. He said that the government should take all the excess money from the rich folk. That doesn't exist. I don't think. Excess money from, in other words, if you save up money to you're in your 70s and you have $1 million laid up, you're a millionaire, the government has the right to come in and take it because you have more than you need and distribute it among the poor. No. Anyway, that's what Huey Long advocated. Take the excess money from the rich and give it to the poor. Every man a king. He ran for president, or started to run for president against Roosevelt. He was assassinated. His son took over and became a congressman. And his son believed, if you ever watched the movie JFK, which came out about 28 years ago, I have a copy of it on DVD at home. But his son was interviewed during the movie, and he said he believed his father was assassinated by the same forces that assassinated President Kennedy. Whatever. Huey Long's son took over his father, but nevertheless, Long's idea of every man a king and redistribution of wealth died with him. Dr. Francis Townsend also believed that there should be an equitable distribution of income. Every man should make the same amount of money